My friends, I would like you to settle into a quiet awareness for just a moment, because the message we begin today is not merely instruction, no, it is revelation. There is a great misunderstanding that has held humanity in bondage for centuries, a belief so deeply woven into religious tradition that most people never think to question it, and yet it is the very belief that keeps the presence of God veiled from their experience. It is the belief that you are a sinner, that you stand outside the grace of God, and must somehow struggle, strive, or suffer your way back into divine favor. But I tell you this, nothing could be further from spiritual truth. For the moment you accept I am a sinner as your identity, you place a wall between yourself and the infinite, which, in truth, has never been absent from you. The tragedy is not that God withholds good, but that through false identification we block the awareness of the good already present. You see, all spiritual healing, all harmony, all peace begins with identity. If you believe yourself to be fallen, guilty, unworthy, then you will interpret every experience through that lens, and your life will mirror the consciousness you hold. But the infinite way teaches that you are not a sinner seeking redemption. You are the spiritual offspring of God, complete and whole, and nothing you have thought or done has ever changed the nature of what God created. Today, we will begin to uncover the secret that transforms the entire spiritual journey, the recognition of your true identity. Not the identity shaped by memory or emotion, not the identity taught by fear or tradition, but the identity established before time, a spiritual identity untouched by your human story. So as we move forward, do not try to agree or disagree. Do not strive to accept or reject. Simply allow these truths to wash over the surface of your consciousness. Let them rest gently within you, for we are beginning a journey that does not lead toward God, but reveals the astonishing fact that you have never been separate from God at all. What hinders you is not your actions, but your belief about yourself. And once that belief is exchanged for recognition, the entire landscape of your life begins to shift. Healing comes not as reward, but as revelation. Peace comes not through effort, but through acknowledgement of what already is. This is the path we open together now. Let us look more deeply now into the nature of suffering, for unless we understand its root, we cannot hope to dissolve it. All suffering, whether it appears as sickness, fear, lack, loneliness, or guilt, arises from a single source, a false sense of identity. The moment you accept yourself as merely a human being, struggling your way through a world of chance and danger, you begin to experience the limitations that accompany that belief. And when you go even further and accept yourself as a sinful being, unworthy of God's presence, then fear becomes your companion, guilt becomes your atmosphere, and separation becomes the fabric of your thought. Yet none of this is truth. It is only the hypnotism of the ages, the inherited belief that who you are is determined by the body you inhabit, the actions you regret, or the thoughts you have allowed to govern you. Consider this carefully. You cannot experience anything higher than the consciousness you hold of yourself. If you believe yourself broken, you will interpret every event as proof of your brokenness. If you believe yourself unworthy, you will shape a world in which worthiness seems forever out of reach. It is not the world that imprisons you, it is the identity you have accepted. And so long as you cling to that mistaken identity, even prayer becomes tainted by fear. For the one who believes he is separated from God will always pray as a beggar, never as a child of the infinite. And a beggar's prayer cannot reveal the fullness of God, for it begins with the assumption of absence, and God is never absent. You see, suffering has never been a punishment from God. It is the shadow cast when we turn away from the truth of our being. Just as darkness is not a force in itself, but merely the absence of light, So suffering is not a power but the absence of recognition. The moment you return to the truth of your identity, not by effort, not by penance, but by simple acknowledgement, the light begins to dawn and the shadows lose their reality. And in that dawning, you discover that the presence of God was never withheld, the love of God never diminished. You had simply lost consciousness of it. The infinite way teaches that your life changes only as your consciousness changes. Nothing external has the power to enslave you. Nothing external has the power to free you. The prison and the key are both within the identity you accept. And so the work before us is not to improve the human self, nor to escape the consequences of the past, but to awaken to the self that has never been touched by a single moment of human experience. When this recognition begins, suffering starts to dissolve not through resistance, but through the gentle fading of an illusion that was never truly part of you. Now, let us turn to the heart of this teaching, for unless you know what you truly are, you cannot possibly release what you are not. And the astonishing truth is this: God has never created a sinner. God has never created a being separate from his own nature. God has never produced anything unlike himself. This is not a poetic idea, it is spiritual law. A perfect cause cannot bring forth an imperfect effect. Infinite love cannot give birth to fear. Eternal spirit cannot produce a fragmented, fallen creature. And if you begin from this foundation, you will see that the entire structure of the sinner identity collapses, for it has no root in God, no root in truth, no root in reality. When we speak of your spiritual identity, we do not speak of something you must attain or develop or earn. We speak of something established long before you drew your first breath, something untouched by every mistake you have made, something unaltered by every shadow you have walked through. You are the expression of God's own being, the appearing of divine consciousness in individualized form. You are not a temporary personality trying to reach God. You are the living activity of God expressing itself as you. And when you understand this, not merely as words, but as inner realization, you will discover why fear dissolves, why guilt loosens its grip, why the heart grows still and quiet. Do not confuse your spiritual identity with the story of your human experience. Your history has nothing to do with what God created. Your past actions, your regrets, your wounds and errors, these belong to the human picture, the outer garment you have worn, but they have never touched the life within you. The life within you is God. The mind within you is God. The love that stirs within you is God. And you are not striving to bring God closer to you. You are awakening to the presence that has always been the center of your being. This is why Goldsmith taught that true prayer is recognition, not petition. You are not trying to convince God of your worthiness. You are remembering the worthiness that God himself established. Once you begin to contemplate this truth, something remarkable occurs. The sense of being a frail, separate individual begins to fade, and you start to feel, perhaps only for a moment at first, the freedom of being an expression of the infinite. The burdens you carried so long begin to lose their weight, because you see they were never carried by the self that God created. They were carried by the false sense of self you assumed. And as this recognition deepens, you will know with certainty, my identity is spiritual, perfect, whole, complete. I am not becoming divine. I am recognizing divinity as my true nature. This is the beginning of healing, of harmony, of peace. For once you know what God created, you stop trying to repair what was never broken. You stop trying to redeem what was never lost. And you awaken quietly and beautifully to the truth that God's offspring remains as God created it forever. Let us look honestly now at why the sinner identity has such a powerful effect on your life. not because it is true, but because you believe it. The moment you accept yourself as unworthy, you close the door to the awareness of God's presence, not to the presence itself, for God never withdraws, but to your awareness of what is already with you. And without awareness, even the greatest truth cannot function in your experience. A lamp may shine in a room, but if your eyes are closed, you remain in darkness. In the same way, when you cling to the belief that you are a sinner pleading for mercy, you shut your eyes to the light that is your very being. You pray for forgiveness, you pray for healing, you pray for supply, all the while assuming that God is far away, reluctant, withholding. But I tell you, God withholds nothing. It is the false sense of self, the sinner sense, that withholds recognition. You see, every form of discord arises from this misidentification. When you believe yourself separated from God, the body responds with tension, fear, and disease, not because God has judged you, but because the consciousness of separation sends shock waves through your entire being. When you believe yourself undeserving, your finances reflect the vibration of lack, for you cannot manifest abundance while clinging to the belief that you do not deserve the good already present. When you believe yourself fundamentally flawed, your relationships mirror that belief, for you cannot see the divine in others while rejecting the divine in yourself. What you hold as true about yourself becomes the lens through which you interpret the world. And as long as that lens is clouded by guilt and shame, the world appears hostile, uncertain, and narrow. Let me state clearly what Goldsmith discovered through decades of healing work. It is not sin that blocks your healing. It is the belief that you are a sinner. Mistakes can be corrected. Actions can be forgiven. But identity is what shapes consciousness, and consciousness shapes experience. The sinner identity produces fear, and fear produces disease. The sinner identity produces unworthiness, and unworthiness produces lack. The sinner identity produces separation, and separation produces loneliness, anxiety, and ceaseless effort. When you try to pray from this identity, your prayer becomes a cry from emptiness rather than a recognition of fullness. You must understand, God has nothing to do with this sense of separation. God has not judged you, condemned you, or withdrawn from you. The entire drama is taking place in the mind that has accepted an identity God never gave. And the very instant you relinquish that identity, even for a breath, you will feel something open within you, a release, a softening, a shift, not because conditions have changed, but because consciousness has changed. And consciousness is the only place where true change occurs. So long as you see yourself as a sinner, your prayers will be filled with pleading, bargaining, hoping. But when you recognize yourself as God's offspring, complete and whole, prayer becomes communion resting in the presence of what already is. Healing begins not because you have earned it, but because the illusion of unworthiness has dissolved. Supply flows not because God has changed his mind, but because you have ceased blocking the flow with fear and self-judgment. Peace arises not because your world becomes perfect, but because you cease defining yourself by the false identity that created the turmoil. The sinner identity is a shadow without substance, but as long as you believe in it, it shapes your world. And the moment you withdraw your belief, the shadow vanishes. Healing, supply, and peace are not rewards. They are the natural state of the soul awakened to its true identity. And now, my friends, we come to the sacred turning point, the moment where spiritual life truly begins. This shift is not an achievement, not an attainment, not a reward for your efforts. It is a recognition, a dawning, the quiet unveiling of what has always been so. For all the harm that the sinner identity has produced, it has no reality of its own. It is a mist that disappears the moment you turn toward the light of truth. And what is that truth? That you are God's spiritual offspring, born not of the flesh, not of the will of man, not of human history, but of the infinite, invisible source that expresses itself as your very being. You do not become God's child, you are God's child. You do not rise into divinity, you awaken to the divinity that has never left you. Recognition is not an act of trying, it is an act of remembering. When you sit quietly and turn inward, you are not attempting to create holiness, nor to summon God from afar. You are uncovering what has been hidden beneath layers of conditioning and fear. You are letting the truth shine through the cracks in your human sense of self. And as you do, you discover with a kind of gentle astonishment that the presence you sought so earnestly was the very life with which you are aware. The mind you believed you had to reach is the mind that has been thinking you, guiding you, sustaining you each moment. You are not separated from God. You are the expression of God. When you begin to accept this, not fully, not perfectly, but even in a small, contemplative way, something shifts at the deepest levels of consciousness. You stop praying as one who lacks and begin resting as one who is. You stop approaching God as an external power to please or persuade and begin experiencing God as the very essence of your identity. This is why Goldsmith insisted that spiritual truth must be recognized, not manufactured. You are not affirming something into existence. You are acknowledging what eternally is. You are not lifting yourself up to heaven. You are realizing that heaven is the consciousness out of which you live and move and have your being. This recognition changes everything. Fear loosens its grip, for fear cannot survive the awareness of oneness. Guilt dissolves, for guilt belongs only to the false self that no longer occupies the center of your consciousness. The striving, the pleading, the perpetual inner conflict begin to fall away, not through discipline but through disuse, because they no longer make sense when you know yourself as the offspring of infinite love. And in this new clarity, you realize that healing is not something you chase. It is something that emerges naturally as the false identity fades. Harmony is not something you construct. It is the natural fragrance of the soul, recognized as divine. Let this recognition occur in its own soft rhythm. Do not force it. Do not try to convince yourself. Simply return again and again to the truth that feels like home. I am God's spiritual child. I always have been. I always will be. Hold this gently, like a delicate flame, and allow it to illuminate your consciousness. For the moment this identity becomes even slightly more real to you than the old sense of separation, the transformation has begun. Now, as we deepen into this truth, it is often helpful to observe how recognition, simple recognition, changes the entire fabric of a person's life. Not because recognition has power of its own, but because it removes the false sense of identity that blocks the activity of God from being realized. Throughout years of spiritual ministry, I witnessed again and again that transformation does not come through trying to be better, nor through pleading for God's intervention, but through awakening to the truth of one's spiritual origin. And I would like to share with you a few illustrations, not as miracles, not as extraordinary exceptions, but as demonstrations of what unfolds when the sinner identity dissolves and the divine identity stands revealed. There was a woman who carried a burden of guilt for nearly 15 years. Every day she lived in the silent torment of believing that God was displeased with her. She approached prayer as a continual apology, a confession of unworthiness. Her body reflected this inner conflict: chronic pain, exhaustion, financial strain. Each of these appeared as outward symbols of an inward belief. One day, in a moment of deep sincerity, she asked, "Why does God not heal me?" And I asked her a simple question: can God's child ever stop being God's child? The question stunned her, not because it was intellectually complex, but because it revealed the impossibility of her belief. If she was the offspring of infinite love, when had that changed? And she could not find a moment. That one recognition, held gently over the months that followed, dissolved the guilt that had ruled her consciousness. Her pain diminished, her finances stabilized, and more importantly, she regained the awareness of God's presence that had felt so distant. Nothing was added to her. Rather, the false identity was removed, and truth revealed itself. Another man, a devout practitioner of traditional religion, lived under constant pressure to be good enough for God. His prayers were filled with anxiety, his days filled with striving. He believed that every error pushed him further from divine favor. When he encountered the teaching of recognition, it seemed almost impossible to accept. Could he truly be God's offspring even with his past? Could identity precede behavior? But he persisted, quietly repeating not as affirmation but as recognition: I am God's spiritual child. Nothing I have done has changed this truth. At first it felt mechanical, even dishonest. Yet, as he persisted in recognition rather than judgment, something subtle began to happen. The inner conflict softened, the tension subsided, sleep returned, anxiety lifted, his health stabilized. He discovered that the moment he stopped trying to deserve God's love and simply accepted his identity as its expression, the peace he had sought for decades arrived gently, naturally, without effort. There was also a woman who lived under the shadow of self-condemnation. She believed that every failure was a mark upon her soul, that she must continually prove her worthiness to God and to others. She did not understand that she was exhausting herself trying to repair an identity that had never been true. When she began the practice of recognition, just a few quiet moments each day, something within her shifted. She no longer saw her past as a defining force, but as a chapter that had nothing to do with the spiritual being God created. As her consciousness shifted from guilt to recognition, a lifelong pattern of emotional heaviness began to lift. Her relationships transformed, not because others changed, but because her perception changed. She no longer approached life as a wounded, insufficient person, but as one who carried divine wholeness within. You see, my friends, these stories are not about miraculous intervention. They are about the natural consequence of awakened identity. When the false sense of self loosens its grip, the divine nature emerges not as something newly given, but as something eternally present. Healing does not descend from heaven. It appears as the clouds of misidentification dissolve. Supply does not arrive from outside. It flows from the consciousness of oneness. Peace does not break into your life. It is revealed when you stop identifying with the turmoil of the human self. Recognition is the key that unlocks what has always belonged to you. And this is why we share these experiences, not to convince the mind, but to awaken the heart to the possibility of your own transformation. For what has been true for others will be true for you the moment you release the identity that never belonged to you and reclaim the identity that has always been yours in God. Now, having seen the nature of false identity and the transformations that unfold when recognition dawns, let us speak of practice not as discipline, not as effort, but as the simple, quiet turning of consciousness toward what is eternally true. For nothing in this teaching asks you to struggle, to force, or to strain. The spiritual life is not achieved by the will of man. It is revealed in the stillness, where human will ceases to operate. If you wish to release the sinner identity, you must understand that it cannot be fought, corrected, or overcome. No amount of self-judgment will free you from judgment. No amount of self-condemnation will lift condemnation. The sinner identity dissolves only in the presence of recognition, just as darkness dissolves not by effort but by the appearance of light. The first movement of this practice is awareness. When guilt arises, when fear speaks, when old memories come forward with accusations, do not resist them and do not accept them. Simply observe. This is not the voice of my true identity. The moment you can witness these thoughts without merging with them, their power is diminished. This is the beginning of freedom. You are stepping back from the hypnotism of the ages and reclaiming the authority of your spiritual nature. Awareness does not fight. Awareness sees, and what is seen without attachment begins to fade. The second movement is the turn, an inward shift of attention, gentle and effortless. You pause for a breath, and you turn toward the silence within. Not to ask, not to plead, not to demand. You turn simply to rest. Be still, the scripture says, and know that I am God. The stillness is your doorway, and the knowing arises within it. This turn is not dramatic. It is almost imperceptible. But in this subtle movement of consciousness, you step out of the human sense of self and into the awareness of the presence that has never left you. The third movement is recognition. You do not create truth, you acknowledge it. And so you rest in quiet inner statements, not affirmations, not mantras, but recognitions of reality. I am God's spiritual child. God is the life of my being. I am not separate. I am not fallen. I am not outside the infinite. These are not to convince God. They are to remind yourself of what God has already established. Speak them silently, gently, with no force. Recognition must be soft, or it is not recognition. It must emerge from within, not be hammered in from without. The fourth movement is resting in the presence. When the words fall away, when the recognition has opened the heart, simply sit in the awareness of being. Do not try to feel God. The attempt to feel is itself a form of separation. Do not try to connect with God. The attempt to connect assumes distance. Rest in the truth that God is the consciousness with which you are aware in this very moment. This is the purest form of spiritual practice, a wordless, formless surrender into what already is. Here, the sinner identity has no place to stand. It cannot exist in the light of direct awareness. It fades like a dream upon waking. The fifth movement is living the recognition. For what value is there in knowing truth for a moment if you abandon it when you rise from your meditation, carry it with you? When a problem arises, pause and remember, I am God's offspring. This situation cannot alter that truth. When a fear comes, stop and recall. Fear belongs to the false self. It is not the voice of the divine within me. When a conflict appears, breathe and ask, what would God, being me, reveal in this moment? This is not effort. This is watching your inner posture and returning gently, repeatedly, to recognition. Bit by bit, the false identity loses its grip. Bit by bit, the divine identity becomes your natural consciousness. And so you see, the practice is not a battle. It is not an argument within the mind. It is the steady remembrance of what you are. This remembrance, held with patience and kindness, dissolves the entire structure of the sinner identity, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, naturally, the way morning light dissolves the night. Recognition is the path, and recognition is the destination. The more you rest in the truth of your divine offspringship, the more you live from the consciousness that heals, provides, harmonizes, and frees. Now, my friends, we turn to the living of this truth, for spiritual realization must become a way of being, not merely a moment of inspiration. It is one thing to glimpse your divine identity in meditation, but it is quite another to walk through your day from that awareness. Yet this is precisely where the transformation occurs. For truth unattended is truth unrealized, and truth unrealized cannot bear fruit in your experience. As long as you identify with the sinner, a self, guilty, fearful, lacking, you will approach life through that lens. But once you begin to recognize yourself as God's spiritual offspring, the entire quality of your consciousness changes, and your outer life naturally follows. In relationships, for example, everything softens. When you no longer believe yourself unworthy, you stop demanding that others confirm your value. You stop needing constant reassurance, constant affirmation, constant proof that you matter. Why? Because you are no longer drawing your sense of worth from the outside. You are living from the infinite worth already embedded in your identity as the expression of God. And in this shift, you become less reactive, more patient, more loving, not because you are trying to be loving, but because love is the nature of the self you have recognized. The need to control others fades. The urge to fix others dissolves. You meet them not as a wounded self seeking comfort, but as the presence recognizing the presence. In your work, the change is equally profound. No longer do you approach your tasks with fear of failure or anxiety about performance. The pressure to prove yourself vanishes when you know your sufficiency is of God. Creativity flows more freely, ideas arise with greater clarity, and decisions become intuitive rather than forced. You do not strive, you allow. You do not scramble, you listen. And from this listening, the right action reveals itself. Success ceases to be something you chase and becomes something that unfolds naturally as an expression of inner harmony. You find yourself less fatigued, less conflicted, because you are no longer carrying the heavy burden of maintaining a false identity. Work becomes an avenue for the divine to express itself through you. Even the body responds. When the sinner identity dissolves, the constant pressure of guilt and unworthiness loosens its hold on the nervous system. Tension leaves the body. Fear no longer produces its harsh chemical storms. The organs function more harmoniously. The breath deepens, the heart slows, the body, which had been reacting to inner conflict, begins to reflect inner peace. Healing emerges, not through trying to heal, but through living from the identity that is already whole. You stop fighting symptoms and begin resting in the truth that your spiritual identity is untouched by any appearance. And as consciousness shifts, the body often follows, gradually aligning with the harmony of the soul. And what of supply? When you no longer see yourself as unworthy or separate from God's abundance, you stop approaching finances with fear. You stop clinging to every decision as if survival depends upon it. Instead, you live from the consciousness that infinite source expresses itself as you. You become receptive to inspiration, opportunities, guidance. You take practical steps, yes, but they flow from peace, not panic. Supply does not come to you. It comes through you, emerging from the consciousness of your unity with infinite life. Lack cannot exist where divine identity is known, for lack is merely the shadow of self-condemnation. As you live from recognition, you will also notice a profound change in how you respond to challenges. The world may present its disturbances, illness, conflict, uncertainty, but your first impulse is no longer fear. Instead, there is a pause, a breath, a turning inward. Despite this appearance, my spiritual identity remains unchanged. And from that truth, clarity comes, wisdom comes, strength comes. You meet the challenges, but you no longer meet them as a struggling human being. You meet them as the divine presence, recognizing itself in the midst of the appearance. This is what it means to embody truth. Not perfection, not constant serenity, but continual return. Again and again, you choose recognition over reaction, identity over illusion, presence over fear. And as you do, the sinner label loses all meaning. It becomes like an old garment that no longer fits, no longer belongs, no longer reflects who you are. You do not remove it by force. You simply outgrow it. And in that outgrowing, you step into the freedom that has always been yours, the freedom of being exactly what God created, whole, complete, spiritual, divine. This is not a future condition. It is your present reality awaiting acknowledgement, and the more consistently you live from it, the more your life becomes a quiet demonstration of the kingdom within. And now, my friends, we bring this message to its quiet conclusion, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a new way of living, a new way of being. For everything we have spoken today leads to a single truth. You are not a sinner trying to become worthy of God. You are God's spiritual offspring, awakening to the truth of what you have always been. All your striving, all your guilt, all your attempts to earn divine favor were based on a misunderstanding of identity. The work now is not to perfect yourself, not to correct yourself, not even to improve yourself, but simply to see yourself rightly, to recognize the divine nature that has remained untouched beneath every human experience. You have not been separated from God for a single instant. The sense of separation existed only in the mind that accepted a false identity. The moment you release that identity, even slightly, you feel the nearness of the presence that has been your very life. You discover that the peace you sought was already within, that the love you longed for was already flowing, that the supply you prayed for was already present as the infinite source expressing itself through you. Nothing has been added, an illusion has been removed. Nothing has been earned. Truth has been acknowledged. Do not expect perfection from yourself. Expect recognition. When old patterns arise, fear, guilt, unworthiness, do not condemn yourself. That condemnation belongs only to the sinner identity, and you are no longer living from that place. Instead, return gently to the truth. I am God's spiritual child. This identity cannot be altered. Let this recognition become the rhythm of your life, not forced, not dramatic, but steady and sincere. The transformation does not come through sudden, heroic effort. It comes through repeated returning again and again to the truth of your being. And as this recognition deepens, something miraculous yet entirely natural begins to unfold. You realize that your life, your relationships, your work, your very body start to reflect the harmony of the consciousness you now hold. You find yourself freer, lighter, less burdened, not because circumstances have changed, but because you have changed, because you are no longer interpreting life through the lens of separation. You are seeing from the consciousness of oneness, of divine identity, of spiritual truth. And from that consciousness, all good flows effortlessly, quietly, inevitably. So I invite you to walk forward from this moment with a new awareness, not of what you must become, but of what you already are. Let this truth travel with you into each conversation, each decision, each challenge. Let it accompany you as a silent presence, reminding you that nothing you encounter can alter the identity God has established. You are the expression of the infinite life, the individualized activity of the divine. And as you live from this realization, you will find that your entire being resonates with peace, with purpose, with inner freedom. Welcome home. Then not to a place, not to a future state, but to the truth of your own identity. Welcome home to the self that God created, the self that has never been separate, never been broken, never been unworthy. Welcome home to the presence within you. Welcome home to the freedom of being exactly what God intended, whole, beloved, eternal,